Using a combination of Zapier and GoToWebinar, we're able to create an online presence for our upcoming Splash event. To start off, create a new GoToWebinar event. So now that we have our event, we can scroll down a little bit to the registration area, and we can see that we don't have any registrants quite yet. Our goal here is going to be simple. Anytime somebody registers for our Splash event, they should also automatically become a registrant for the GoToWebinar event that we just created. Now before we go into Zapier to hook all of this up, let's go into Splash and make sure there's at least one registrant so we have some data to map back and forth. Okay, so now in Zapier, we're going to go ahead and create a new Zap. The first thing we'll do is choose the Splash app, and then we're going to say it's a new attendee trigger. Then you'll choose which Splash account, which chances are you'll only have your one, and then you'll choose your event. If we click Test and Review, we'll see all the information that was sent from Splash to Zapier about that guest, including what they filled out on the form and all the details about the event. Next, select GoToWebinar and choose Create Registrant. We'll choose which GoToWebinar account we'll actually be using, and then from Webinar, we find the webinar that we created, and then we map up fields from Splash into GoToWebinar. Source will be there automatically, and you can map whatever you want in there. In this case, I chose the subdomain that my event is at, and then I mapped up first name, last name, and email. But any question that you ask on a Splash form can be mapped to any field in GoToWebinar. Press Continue. Test it, and you should be all set. Just for good measure, I'm going to go over here and name my new Zap something meaningful so that I can find it later. And of course, I'm going to turn it on. Because of the tests that we did in Zapier earlier, one of our registrants is already now on the registration list in GoToWebinar. Going forward, anybody who makes their way onto your Splash event level guest list with the status of RSVP yes will automatically be sent to GoToWebinar via Zapier to become a registrant for that webinar. Let's test this a little bit further by adding another guest onto the guest list, but not immediately having their status become RSVP yes. Perhaps maybe they've just been invited, but haven't actually registered. If we check the registrants list in GoToWebinar, we'll see that Wooden Blocks has not been added yet. But when we change their status, Zapier will automatically have the new data sent and add them to the registration list. Combining Splash, Zapier, and GoToWebinar means that you don't have to compromise on branding while marketing your amazing event, and all the registrants from around the world can take part in the experience. In a previous video, we showed how to connect a Splash event to a GoToWebinar event using Zapier. We made it so that every registration that happened on the Splash event page turned into a registration for the GoToWebinar event. In this video, we're going to make the flow of data bidirectional by making it so that every time somebody attends that same webinar, they show up as a checked-in guest on the Splash event guest list. To make this happen, we're going to create a new Zap in Zapier and start off with GoToWebinar. We'll choose the trigger event to be new attendee, which is based on an attendee actually coming or attending the GoToWebinar event. We'll choose the account that we've already got set up and press Continue. From there, we're going to make sure that we chose the same event that we used in the last example, in this case our Boston Product Launch Roadshow Online Access. We'll test and review, which is going to pull a list of registrants that are already on the registration list from GoToWebinar. And then we'll click Done. Now that we've set up our GoToWebinar trigger, we need to set up our Splash action. So we'll choose the Splash app, and we'll choose our action, which in this case is Update Attendee. This means that if the guest is new and hasn't existed on the Splash event guest list before, they'll be added. If a guest with that email address already exists on the Splash guest list, then their status will just be updated to checked in. We'll make sure that we choose the correct event, and then we'll map the email address since that's how we're going to look up our guest. We'll make a decision about whether or not to send a confirmation email. In this case, I said no, but you can do whatever you'd like. And in this case, we're going to say, whenever this happens, check the person in. We'll map first name and last name, of course, as well, and any other fields that are available from GoToWebinar. We'll press Continue. And finally, we'll click on Test and Continue, which will actually send one of those check-ins to Splash. So you'll actually see one of those check-ins on the event level guest list already. Now that we're done with this Zap, it's always best practice to make sure you give it a meaningful name so that we can always go back to the correct one later. And of course, we need to turn the Zap on. At this point, all I need to do is start my webinar and have people actually attend. Whenever somebody actually shows up to the webinar, they're set up so that when the webinar ends, they are marked as attended by Zapier, and that will trigger and automatically check them in on the Splash guest list.